When Michael Chandler showed up in Kirtland, Ohio, with his Egyptian mummies and papyri in early July 1835, Joseph Smith saw an opportunity to translate an ancient text that would confirm some of his recent doctrinal developments, as well as be available for public inspection, unlike the gold plates from which he claimed to have translated the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith began immediately to exploit Chandler's documents by comparing them to his Book of Mormon characters. According to Assistant President Oliver Cowdery, the morning Mr. Chandler first presented his papyrus to Brother Smith, he was shown by the latter a number of characters like those upon the writings of Mr. Chandler, which were previously copied from the plates containing the history of the Nephites or Book of Mormon. At Chandler's request, according to Cowdery, Brother Smith gave him the interpretation of some few characters for his satisfaction. Cowdery then reproduced a certificate Chandler supplied, unsolicited, attesting to Joseph Smith's ability as a translator. Dated Kirtland, July 6, 1835. This is to make known to all who may be desirous concerning the knowledge of Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. in deciphering the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic characters in my possession, which I have, in many eminent cities, shown unto the most learned. And from the information that I could even learn or meet with, I find that of Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. to correspond in the most minute matters. Signed, Michael H. Chandler. How seriously Chandler's statement can be taken is a fair question, since he stood to make a great deal of money. The details of Champollion's decipherment of the Rosetta Stone were not widely disseminated in the United States, and it is unlikely that the learned could decipher the Egyptian characters. Yet, it is possible that Joseph Smith could have made some general observations about the papyri that might have coincided with what the learned had told Chandler. One point of possible agreement could have been the hypocephalus, which may have reminded Joseph Smith and his contemporaries of magic amulets, the zodiac, and astronomy, for which the Egyptians were well known. In December 1835, Cowdery reported that Chandler had sold some of the artifacts prior to his arrival at Kirtland, including a small quantity of papyrus, similar, as he says, to the astronomical representation contained with the present 2 rolls, obviously referring to the circular hypocephalus. Although Joseph Smith had obtained a statement from Chandler that seemed to confirm his abilities as a translator, he had nevertheless learned from this stranger from the East that whatever translation he would eventually offer the public, he could feel confident that it could not be exposed by the learned. Hi, I'm Dan Vogel. In the previous video, we discovered that the first part of the alphabets was related to fragments of the Book of the Dead owned by Amenhotep that were copied into the valuable Discovery notebooks, which Joseph Smith translated as the epitaph of Princess Ketumen, who supposedly lived about 1,000 years before Jesus. This discovery challenges the apologist's theory that the alphabets and bound grammar were created after Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham and was an attempt by W. W. Phelps at reverse translation. In this video, I will explore how Part 2 of the alphabets incorporates Joseph Smith's teachings about the pure Adamic language dating to 1832, which also challenges the apologist's reverse translation theory. However, as we will discover, Joseph Smith's previous musings on the pure language, like the Ketumen material, also find their way into the Book of Abraham. While apologist John Gee could see nothing in the alphabets that could produce the Book of Abraham, his colleague Brian Hauglid referred to the similarities as evidence that the 2 groups of documents were connected, although he got the order of production wrong. Concerning the alphabets and bound grammar, Hauglid asserted, "At this point, the Egyptian manuscripts appear to be dependent on the text of the Book of Abraham. That is to say, the Book of Abraham was already in existence before the Egyptian papers were produced. However, it is difficult to determine exactly what Phelps and some of the early brethren were trying to do with these papers. But one thing is clear, The Book of Abraham is closely related to the Egyptian manuscripts. As we saw in the previous video, Part 1 of the alphabets was derived from the epitaph of Ketumen, not the Book of Abraham, although the subject of Egypt being discovered by a woman while it was still under water was later used by Joseph Smith in his dictation of the Book of Abraham in November 1835. While Hauglid linked the Book of Abraham to the alphabets and grammar based on the similarity of content, he gave no explanation for the material that does not appear in Joseph Smith's translation, a problem that is created by his attempt to reverse the order in which Joseph Smith produced these documents. The old nibbly apologetic that the alphabets and bound grammar were created by Joseph Smith's scribes attempting to systematize his translation of Abraham's record into a grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language must be abandoned as groundless fiction. My examination of Part 2 of the alphabets that follows will also challenge the apologist's reverse translation theory. We will be looking at the 59 characters that comprise Part 2 of the alphabets, paying particular attention to the first 13 characters. Characters 14 to 42 were taken from the top portion of column 3 of the Breathing Permit of Hor, and mixed with invented or derivative characters. Characters 43 to 59 were copied sequentially from the bottom portion of column 3. According to University of Chicago Egyptologist Klaus Baer, the first 13 characters differ in general appearance from the other characters and don't appear to be hieratic Egyptian. At the time Baer examined Joseph Smith's Egyptian papyri and related documents in 1968, it was not known that numbers 4 through 9 were identical to characters said to have come from the pure language spoken by Adam and his posterity until the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel. On the 26th of May, 1835, more than a month before Joseph Smith came into possession of the Egyptian papyri, W. Phelps, who was living with Joseph Smith and working as his scribe, wrote to his wife in Missouri and included a specimen of some of the pure language. Like the Egyptian alphabets, this specimen is arranged in columns, although with different names and definitions. They are Amen, God, Son Amen, Son of God, Sons Amen, Sons of God ordained, Anglo, angels, Sons Amen, children of men, Olea, the earth. The names and definitions of all but the last character were given by Joseph Smith as early as March 1832, while he and his small family were living in Hiram, Ohio, with John Johnson and his family. This document is headed A Sample of Pure Language, given by Joseph the Seer, as copied by Brother Johnson, and conveys the same information in a question and answer format. What is the name of God in pure language? Amen. What is the meaning of the pure word Amen? It is the being which made all things in all its parts. What is the name of the Son of God? The Son, Amen. What is the Son, Amen? It is the greatest of all the parts of all man, which is the Godhead, the firstborn. What is man? This signifies sons all men, the human family, the children of men, the greatest parts of all man's sons, the Son, all man. What are angels called in pure language? All man, angels man. What are the meaning of these words? All man's ministering servants, sanctified, who are sent forth from heaven to minister for or to sons all man, the greatest part of all man's son, sons all man, son all man, all man. Before Joseph Smith obtained the Egyptian papyri, he was occupied with the idea of a pure Adamic language. The Book of Mormon contains the story of a people called the Jaredites, who at the time of the confounding of language at the Tower of Babel, mentioned in Genesis, petitioned God to keep their language pure. God allowed them to retain their original language and sent them to the American continent. As early as December 1830, Smith amended Genesis to include mention of a book of remembrance that was kept among the ancient patriarchs, written in the language of Adam, which was pure and undefiled. Joseph Smith and the early Mormons associated the gift of tongues with the pure language. Shortly after meeting Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio in September 1832, Brigham Young broke into an ecstatic display of the gift of tongues, which, as Young later recalled, Smith declared was the pure Adamic language. After which, according to an early draft of Young's history, Joseph Smith declared that the same spirit and gift is upon me, and I wish to speak in an unknown tongue, which he did and interpreted, declaring it was the pure language which he spoke, and exhorted the brethren to seek after that gift. In addition to speaking the pure language occasionally, Joseph Smith was also known to declare the Adamic names for geographic locations. As early as 1831, while visiting Independence, Missouri, Joseph Smith declared it was the location of the prophesied city of Zion, which in the original language was Zomar. Another location was Adam-on-Dy-Ammon, which in 1838 Joseph Smith located 80 miles north of Zomar, explaining that it was the place where Adam shall come to visit his people, or the Ancient of Days shall sit, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet. While making revisions in his revelations in early 1835, before publishing them later that year, Joseph Smith greatly expanded a revelation on priesthood originally dictated in November 1831. In this expansion, probably dictated sometime in March or April 1835, Joseph Smith declared, 3 years previous to the death of Adam, he called Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalaleel, Jared, Enoch, and Methuselah, who were all high priests, with the residue of his posterity who were righteous, into the valley of Adam-on-Dy-Ammon, and there bestowed upon them his last blessing. It is no accident, therefore, that both Zomar and Adam-on-Dy-Ammon appear in one of Joseph Smith's definitions in the second part of the bound grammar. In the alphabets, character 15, Beth, is defined as man's first residence, fruitful garden, a valley, a place of happiness. As developed in the 5th degree in the bound grammar, it is defined as the place appointed of God for the residence of Adam, Adam-on-Dy-Ammon, a fruitful garden made to be fruitful by blessing or promise, great valley or plain given by promise, fitted with fruit trees and precious flowers, made for the healing of man, good to the task, pleasing to the eye, sweet and precious, delightful to the smell, place of happiness, purity, holiness, and rest, even Zomar, Zion. So even as Joseph Smith developed his ideas in the bound grammar, the pure or Adamic language was very much on his mind, giving further evidence of the source of his ideas in the second part of the alphabets. Perhaps the most important feature of Smith's spring 1835 expansion of the Revelation pertains to the recently introduced Patriarchal Priesthood. On the 6th of December 1834, Joseph Smith had Sidney Rigdon ordain his father, 62-year-old Joseph Smith Sr., to the office of Patriarch of the Church. As the Old Testament made no mention of priesthood being handed down from Adam through the ancient patriarchs, Joseph Smith's expansion provided an ordination lineage, stating that the patriarchal priesthood was instituted in the days of Adam and came down by lineage from father to son until Noah. The expanded revelation then declares that in the valley of Adam-on-Dy-Ammon, Adam stood up in the midst of the congregation, and notwithstanding he was bowed down with age, being full of the Holy Ghost, predicted whatsoever should befall his posterity unto the latest generation. These things were all written in the book of Enoch, and are to be testified in due time. The book of Enoch would have been written in the pure language. It may be that Phelps's pure language specimen of characters, names, and definitions was part of Joseph Smith's effort to produce a book of Enoch, and the characters were designed to increase confidence that the words produced by revelation were from an actual record that would never be exhibited, much as the facsimile of Book of Mormon characters he produced 7 years earlier had convinced Martin Harris. If Joseph Smith was preparing to provide pseudepigraphic evidence for his introduction of the Patriarchal Priesthood, it was interrupted by the arrival of the Egyptian papyri, which, as we shall see, were employed by Joseph Smith to do just that. This is evident in Part 2 of the Alphabets and Bound Grammar, as well as in the first lines of the book of Abraham, where Abraham is made to declare, I sought for the blessings of the fathers, and the right whereunto I should be ordained to administer the same, a rightful heir, a high priest, holding the right belonging to the fathers, from the beginning of time, even from the beginning, or before the foundation of the earth, down to the present time, even the right of the firstborn, or first man, who is Adam, or first father, through the fathers, unto me. Less than 2 weeks before the arrival of Michael Chandler, Joseph Smith preached on the evangelical order, meaning the patriarchal priesthood. When Chandler arrived with his papyri, Joseph Smith saw an opportunity to translate real ancient records that the learned had declared undecipherable. He had only to convince his colleagues, especially the pretentious Phelps, that he was actually translating. After identifying the mummies and authors of the 2 rolls of papyrus, Joseph Smith began recording his ideas in the Egyptian alphabets. It would only be natural for him to transfer his previous thoughts about Adam, Enoch, and the patriarchal priesthood to the Egyptian project. In doing so, the narrative necessarily shifted to patriarchs who had dealings with Egypt, most obviously Abraham and Joseph, who lived after the corruption of language at the Tower of Babel. However, Joseph Smith was careful to explain that Abraham had access to records of previous patriarchs, presumably Adam's Book of Remembrance and the Book of Enoch. Therefore, Joseph Smith had Abraham declare, the records of the fathers, even the patriarchs, concerning the right of the priesthood, the Lord my God preserved in mine own hands. Therefore, a knowledge of the beginning of creation, and also of the planets and of the stars, as it was made known unto the fathers, have I kept even unto this day. In discussing the record of ancient Joseph in December 1835, Oliver Cowdery made an explicit connection to the Book of Enoch and revealed the possible source of Joseph Smith's inspiration. Cowdery said that upon the scroll of Joseph was found a drawing of Enoch's pillar as mentioned by Josephus. Our present version of the Bible does not mention this fact, but Josephus says that the descendants of Seth were virtuous and possessed a great knowledge of the heavenly bodies, and that, in consequence of the prophecy of Adam, that the world should be destroyed once by water and again by fire. Enoch wrote a history or an account of the same and put it into the 2 pillars, one of brick and the other of stone, and that the same were in being or existence at his, Josephus's, day. It seems more than coincidence that Josephus, a first-century Romano-Jewish scholar and historian who was well known to Joseph Smith's contemporaries, would mention the prophecy of Adam and the record of Enoch, as well as the knowledge of the heavenly bodies and their order, being handed down by the descendants of Seth. It also seems more than chance that Josephus refers to Egypt as Mestri, and the Egyptians Mestrians. And Joseph Smith, in Part 1 of the Bound Grammar, said that Abraham was forewarned of God to go down into Mestra, or Egypt, and preach the gospel unto the Mestraans. Similar to the 10 generations of patriarchs listed in the expanded revelation previously discussed, Part 2 of the alphabets traces the authority line from Adam to Beeth-Ku, or the 5th high priest from Adam, which was Mahalaleel, Enoch's grandfather. Josephus also described the right to govern being handed down through the patriarchs, that Enos delivered the government to Canaan, his son, and that several generations later, Methuselah delivered the government to his son, Lamech. When Lamech had governed 777 years, he appointed Noah, his son, to be ruler of the people, and retained the government 950 years. Thus, both the alphabets and Josephus mention the succession of patriarchal rulers, which is absent from the Genesis account. In late September 1835, while copying blessings into the new Patriarchal Blessing book, Oliver Cowdery greatly expanded the blessings Joseph Smith gave Smith family members in 1833, no doubt under Joseph Smith's supervision. To Joseph Smith Sr.'s blessing was added a reference to his holding the right of the patriarchal priesthood, followed by a quote about Adam blessing his posterity in the valley of Adam on Diamond, From the 1831 revelation, Joseph Smith had only recently expanded. The expanded blessing then declares, "So shall it be with my father. He shall be called a prince over his posterity, holding the keys of the patriarchal priesthood over the kingdom of God on earth, even the church of the Latter-day Saints." Of course, Joseph Smith Sr. hadn't been ordained to this office until December 1834, yet Cowdery claimed that the blessings he was about to record were correct and according to the mind of the Lord. In his introduction to the patriarchal blessings, Cowdery stated that Joseph Smith Sr. got his authority to give blessings from his son Joseph Smith Jr., the first elder and first patriarch of the church, and others. Cowdery then explained that he and Joseph Smith received authority first from the visitation of John the Baptist in May 1829, and subsequently they received the high and holy priesthood, but an account of this will be given elsewhere or in another place. Cowdery further explained that prior to the first reception of authority, our souls were drawn out in mighty prayer to know how we might obtain the blessings of baptism and of the Holy Spirit, according to the order of God. And we diligently sought for the right of the fathers and the authority of the holy priesthood, and the power to administer in the same. For we desired to be followers of righteousness and the possessors of greater knowledge, even the knowledge of the mysteries of the kingdom of God. Cowdery's words were no doubt influenced by the opening verses to the Book of Abraham, which by late September 1835 had been entered into the translation book by W. W. Phelps, or were available to Cowdery in manuscript form. After this, Cowdery stated, "Therefore we repaired to the woods, even as our father Joseph said we should, that is, to the bush, and called upon the name of the Lord, and he answered us out of the heavens. And while we were in the heavenly vision, the angel came down and bestowed upon us this priesthood. And then, as I have said, we repaired to the water and were baptized." No doubt this alludes to the content of one of the scrolls of papyrus, identified by Joseph Smith as the record of Joseph. On the 2nd of October 1835, Cowdery copied into the Patriarchal Blessing book a blessing Joseph Smith gave him in 1833, which was expanded to include references to Smith's and Cowdery's recent claims to angelic ordinations, the patriarchal priesthood, and the prophecy of ancient Joseph, all of which were developments dating to after the original blessing. The new wording has Joseph Smith declare, "He, Cowdery, shall sit in the council of the patriarchs with his brother Joseph, and with him have part in the keys of that ministry when the Ancient of Days shall come. For he shall have part with me in the keys of the kingdom of the last days. And we shall judge this generation by our testimony, and the keys shall never be taken from us. These blessings shall come upon him, Oliver, according to the blessings of the prophecy of Joseph in ancient days, which he said should come upon the seer of the last days and the scribe that should sit with him, and that should be ordained with him by the hand of the angel in the bush unto the lesser priesthood, and after receive the holy priesthood under the hands of those who had been held in reserve for a long season, even those who received it under the hand of the Messiah, while he should dwell in the flesh upon the earth, and should receive the blessings with him, even the seer of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saith he, even Joseph of old." This alludes to the claimed visitation of ancient apostles Peter, James, and John, which Cowdery and Smith failed to mention until 1835, when Smith expanded an 1830 revelation about the use of wine in the sacrament. This expansion made passing reference to Peter and James and John, whom I have sent unto you, by whom I have ordained you and confirmed you to be apostles. From Cowdery's September 1835 introduction and the expanded portion of Cowdery's blessing, it is quite apparent that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery intended to use the Egyptian papyri to support the recent introduction of the patriarchal priesthood and claims to angelic ordination, which located them at the top of the emerging church hierarchy and insulated them from any challengers. As previously noted, characters 4 through 9 in Part 2 of the alphabets were taken from Joseph Smith's previous work on the pure language. Egyptologist Klaus Baer's comment that the first 13 characters differ in general appearance from the other characters and don't appear to be hieratic Egyptian indicates that the surrounding characters up to number 13 were possibly from the Pure Language Project that preceded the arrival of the Egyptian papyri. How these Adamic characters could appear in the middle of an Egyptian alphabet is not explained. But this creates a problem for the apologists who want to argue that the alphabets in bound grammar represent a reverse translation of the Book of Abraham. Similar to Part 1, discussed in the previous video, the first 13 characters of Part 2 are arranged by shapes. 1 through 3 are combinations of angled lines and a dot, or short dash. 4 through 5 are very similar in shape. 6 through 8 are variations of right angles, and 9 through 13 are combinations of horizontal hooks. The next group, characters 14 to 42, are copied from column 3 of the Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, and although sometimes difficult to match up with characters on the papyrus, it is clear that some are copied out of sequence and sometimes separated by characters that are not from column 3. According to Baer, character 14, which looks like a caret symbol, probably represents the first traces of ink visible at the upper edges of line or column 3 of the breathing permit of Hor, but has since broke off. This is followed by 4 variations of that shape. While Baer interpreted this as evidence that the characters were copied from a badly damaged top portion of column 3 and shows that the ink was flaked much as it is now, a more likely explanation is that Joseph Smith intentionally added characters derived from the shape of the character that he saw on the papyrus, which, as we will see, he does again in subsequent portions of column 3. Character 24, for example, is shaped like a bird and appears near the top of column 3, but characters 25 through 28, which are stylized versions of the bird character, are not found on the papyrus. Character 32 looks like a man with his arms raised above his head, which no doubt reminded Joseph Smith of the Masonic sign for grief and distress. In the alphabet, Joseph Smith gave it the name Ho-Ha-Oop, but did not define it. Later, in the bound grammar, it was defined as one who intercedes for another, or invocation. Characters 33 and 34 are V and U shapes, or abstractions of the raised arms. They are not found on the papyrus, but are similarly defined in the grammar as a sign among the Egyptians that is used for influence or power, or a sign made use of for one to escape his enemies. The appearance of Masonic-like secret signs at the time of the patriarchs is a theme Joseph Smith had discussed as early as April 1829, when he dictated the account in the Book of Mormon of Alma's commanding his son, Helaman, to suppress the records of the Jaredites, that they may not know the mysteries and the works of darkness, and their secret works, retain all their oaths, and their covenants, and their agreements in secret abominations, yea, and all their signs and their wonders, ye shall keep from this people. The following month, Joseph Smith dictated the account in the Book of Ether of a conspiracy to murder the Jaredite king Omer, which states that Achish did administer unto them the oaths which were given by them of old, who also sought power, which had been handed down even from Cain, who had been a murderer from the beginning. In December 1830, as part of his revision of the Bible, Joseph Smith expanded Genesis to include an account of Cain making a secret oath with Satan and exclaiming, "Truly, I am Mahan, the master of this great secret." Thereafter, Cain was called Master Mahan, no doubt inspired by Master Mason, the third degree of Freemasonry. Character 35 is a right angle, which is also not on the papyrus, but perhaps related to the Masonic theme of the previous characters, or simply a variation of the next character, which is on the papyrus and appears twice in the alphabet list, once before the 3 circles and again after them. The 3 circles do not appear on the papyrus, but in Cowdery's alphabet they are named and identified as Ja-O-A, the earth, etc., Flo-S, moon, and Flos-Isis, sun. It is unclear why, but the symbol for the earth appeared in the almanacs of Joseph Smith's day. Character 42 is the last to receive a name, Kolob, and the first of an uninterrupted sequential copying of the characters from column 3, making a total of 59 characters. The sequential copying of characters from the columns of Joseph Smith Papyrus 1 continued with Part 3 containing characters from column 2, Part 4 containing characters from column 1, and Part 5 containing characters from column 5. We have seen how the alphabets borrowed at least 6 characters from the Pure Language project Joseph Smith was developing prior to the arrival of the Egyptian papyri. We have also seen how, in giving definitions of character 15, Joseph Smith employed the Adamic place names of Adamon, Diamon, and Zomar. Phelps's Adamic characters, names, and definitions were not simply a summary of Joseph Smith's 1832 answers to questions, but added new material. They can be compared as follows. Phelps's version adds the earth and divides humankind into sons of God, or those ordained, and the children of men. Part 2 of the alphabets builds on Phelps's version of the pure language, as can be seen from the following comparison. The two records cover the same material, but the alphabets multiply and refine the categories. The first 9 characters discuss God, the firstborn Son, 2 grades of angels, spirits, and resurrected beings, 4 grades of ministers, high priests, lesser priests, priests ordained but not of God, and unordained ministers, and finally, all mankind. Reflecting the concern for patriarchal succession of priesthood, discussed in Joseph Smith's spring 1835 expansion to his 1831 revelation, as well as possible influence from Josephus, characters 10 through 14 list the 5 generations of patriarchal government previously discussed. Character 15 represents humankind's first residence on earth, followed by 5 degrees of improvement, which leads to the earth in its purified state, then to all the heavenly bodies, and finally to the celestial kingdom or God's residence. This is where Part 2 of the alphabets ended for a time. Later, in Joseph Smith's alphabet, Cowdery inserted the names to numbers 24 through 41. Still later, Joseph Smith and Warren Parrish added the last name, Kolob, number 42, to 2 of the alphabets. As we shall see in a subsequent video, when Joseph Smith added definitions to the names in the bound grammar, he picked up the theme of the celestial kingdom to discuss the different grades of the heavenly bodies, which evolves into an elaborate cosmology. Later, in Nauvoo, when resuming the translation in March 1842, Joseph Smith drew on this cosmological material in the bound grammar for his dictation of Chapter 3 of the Book of Abraham, as well as his explanation of Facsimile 2. This is important because it means that the germ of Joseph Smith's ideas about the hierarchy of stars and planets began before his acquisition of the Egyptian papyri, and grew out of his thoughts about the pure language and the hierarchy of heavenly and earthly beings, which, in the bound grammar, got projected onto the cosmos. Such a situation makes the apologist theory that the alphabets in bound grammar were created after the Book of Abraham untenable, since it is clear that the evolution of thought goes in the opposite direction. So far in our discussion of the alphabets, Abraham's name has not been mentioned. This situation has caused Guy Amelestein to make other hasty conclusions about the alphabets. Not knowing the origin of parts 1 and 2, Guy assumed in his 2000 article that all the characters came from the Book of Breathings and tried to argue the fact that the only one of these manuscripts to have Joseph Smith's handwriting on it matches Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, but not the Book of Abraham, would indicate that Joseph Smith did not think the Book of Breathings was the Book of Abraham. One problem with Guy's assertion is that some of the definitions are related to the Book of Abraham, as we have seen with regard to Egypt being discovered by a woman while it was underwater. Another problem is that the alphabets do contain explicit references to Abraham, when it translates the meaning of 3 characters that were copied from the breathing permit of Hor, rather than from the missing text Guy Amelestein imagined was attached to the end of the breathing permit. One of these characters was copied from column 2 of Joseph Smith Papyrus 1 into part 3 of the alphabets. Next to this character in each of the alphabets is written Kai-a broam, Kai-a bra oam, Zubzul oan. Here, broam, an obvious variant of the name Abraham, was written first, and the prefix Kai was subsequently added by different methods in each. We saw this character in the first video at the beginning of the Book of Abraham text, copied by Phelps into the translation book. On page 3 of the bound grammar, Phelps broke this character down into its separate parts. The middle part of the character, a dot and hook, is given the definition reflecting the promise Abraham received in Genesis 12, and more closely the wording in the Book of Abraham, chapter 1, verse 2. The last two characters in the alphabets were not taken from the columns of Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, but rather they were the first two characters from column 1 of Joseph Smith Papyrus 11, which have since flaked off and are no longer visible, but they are the correct hieratic characters for the Book of the Dead. Here we can see the beginning of the translation of the Book of Abraham, with the top character representing the land of the Chaldeans, and the bottom character representing Abraham, the father of the faithful, which in the translation book was connected to the first verse of the Book of Abraham. Note here that the first character is keyed to the land of the Chaldeans, and that the second character is keyed to Abraham. In Joseph Smith's alphabet, the translation of the characters was cancelled by Cowdery, who turned the page, drew the bottom character, and then recorded its translation in all 5 degrees of its meaning. In the first degree, Abraham signifies the father of the faithful, the first right, the elders. Second degree, same sound, a follower of righteousness. Third degree, same sound, one who possesses great knowledge. Fourth degree, same sound, a follower of righteousness, a possessor of greater knowledge. Fifth degree, Abraham, the father of many nations, a prince of peace, one who keeps the commandments of God, a patriarch, a rightful heir, a high priest. At this point, it was probably perceived that more room was needed, and so the project moved into the bound grammar. To say, as Guy does, that the alphabets do not mention Abraham, and that Joseph Smith did not think the Book of Breathings was the Book of Abraham, is clearly erroneous, and demonstrates he is unfamiliar with the material he is attempting to explain to his Mormon audience. The alphabets and bound grammar give us a clear and detailed view of Joseph Smith's method of creating the text of the Book of Abraham. Moreover, it shows his willingness to provide evidence and to instill confidence in his followers that his pseudepigraphic text and the doctrines it contained were authoritative. It is therefore not surprising that Mormon apologists have devised various arguments to relieve Joseph Smith from responsibility for both the alphabets and bound grammar. According to Guy, W. W. Phelps is the true author of the bound grammar. Moreover, the 5-degree system was all Phelps's misunderstanding and had nothing to do with Joseph Smith. Next to a picture of the first page of the bound grammar in his 2017 book, Introduction to the Book of Abraham, Guy asserted that it represented W. W. Phelps's speculations on Egyptian grammar in his handwriting. Obviously referring to the alphabets, Guy further asserted, while some of the manuscripts use the terms degree and part as modern fragment and column to indicate where in the papyri the sign in question comes from, Phelps misunderstood them to be some sort of grammatical term. Thus, according to Guy, the degree and 5-part system in the alphabets had nothing to do with grammar, but was merely a way of locating characters on the papyrus, arguing that Part 1 of the first degree would be Fragment 1, or Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, Column 1. Part 2 would be Column 2 of the same fragment, and so forth. However, none of the characters show up where this theory predicts. As we have discovered, Part 1 of the first degree came from the missing Amenhotep papyrus copied into the valuable Discovery notebooks, and the first third of Part 2 of the first degree came from the pure language. The second third came from Column 3, but it was mixed with invented or derivative characters and hence not found on the papyrus. When characters are copied sequentially from the columns of Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, only part 5 of the alphabets matches what Guy's theory represents. The theory that the terms degree and part were a locating system was first introduced in 1970 by John Tvetnes, formerly a scholar at Brigham Young University's Institute for the Study and Preservation of Ancient Religious Texts, though in a different form than recently presented by Guy. Tvetnes argued that the terms degree and part were intended as a directional system even in the bound grammar, and that modern readers have misunderstood them as grammar terms. In 1992, Tvetnes told Guy, "I showed that the terms degree and part in the alphabet and grammar were not intended as grammatical terms. Rather, they denote the location of the symbols on the papyri. The first part, for example, is what we call facsimile 1. The first degree of that part is the first column of the script, while the second degree is the second column, and so forth. The second part is what Nibley termed the small Sinsen papyrus. It is pasted on paper marked with 1-inch vertical rulings. The first degree of the second part denotes the first of these columns, counting from the right. Much of the alphabet and grammar is merely a means of giving map coordinates for locating the symbols on the papyri. The first thing to notice is that Tvetnes applied the terms the opposite of what Guy recently defined. The parts refer to fragments instead of columns, and degrees refer to lines or columns. Hence, according to Tvetnes, Part 1 of the bound grammar pertains to Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, and the 5 degrees are the 5 columns of characters. The second part, Tvetnes maintained, is Joseph Smith Papyrus 11. However, the grid of lines to which Tvetnes refers is nothing more than the design of the interior of the Kirtland Temple, the large pieces of paper having been repurposed for mounting the papyri. On Joseph Smith Papyrus 11, the lines represent the middle pews, while on Fragment 1, the locations of a chimney and the corner pews are visible from behind the mounted papyrus. Comparing these fragments with a draft Frederick G. Williams made later in 1833 of a similar temple to be built in Independence, Missouri, the papyrus appears to have been mounted on the southwest corner of the discarded plan. Moreover, Joseph Smith Papyrus 11 was still attached to the left side of facsimile 1 when they were mounted together on the backing paper and only later cut into separate pieces. It is doubtful that the papyri had been mounted before Smith, Cowdery, and Phelps began working on the alphabets and bound grammar. Indeed, Guy has suggested the mounting of the papyri probably occurred in 1837. This means that Joseph Smith Papyrus 1 and 11 had not been separated and therefore would not have been considered different fragments. Tvetnes's theory was based on the most superficial understanding of the documents and is inaccurate in nearly every detail. Nevertheless, in 1992, Guy used Tvetnes's theory to criticize the works of some critics. In his 2000 essay, Guy adopted Tvetnes's definitions and applied them to the alphabets. The columns on the left in the alphabets are filled with characters from various columns of the Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, identified by degree, column or line, and part, fragment. This was opposite from what he most recently argued in his 2017 book. While scrapping Tvetnes's grid theory, Guy nevertheless tries to salvage Tvetnes's character locating apologetic by limiting its application to the alphabets and reversing the definitions. Guy has evidently decided that the 5-degree system in the bound grammar, contrary to Tvetnes's assertion, is a reference to grammar, but that it was the result of Phelps's misunderstanding. How Phelps could be confused about the meaning of the terms degree and part after taking the lead with Cowdery in the alphabet phase of the project, as Guy maintains, is not explained. The meaning of degree is not immediately apparent since the alphabets deal only with the 5 parts of the first degree, whereas the bound grammar deals with 5 degrees of only the first part and 2/3 of the second part. Nevertheless, at the end of Joseph Smith's alphabet, in Cowdery's handwriting, Abroam is given a definition in all 5 degrees, as previously discussed. Thus, the 5-degree system can be traced to the end of the alphabet project, quite independent from Phelps. Guy's assertion that Phelps misunderstood the term degree in the alphabets as some sort of grammatical term, and that the 5-degree system in the bound grammar was Phelps's speculations on Egyptian grammar, is therefore completely without foundation. To further relieve Joseph Smith from responsibility, Guy makes another absurd suggestion about the nature of the alphabets. While Oliver Cowdery and W. W. Phelps worked on versions of this document, Joseph Smith copied their work, ignoring the column divisions and categories and dropping out text. This indicates that Joseph Smith cared less about the document than Cowdery or Phelps, and that it probably was not his idea. This statement is highly inaccurate, and its conclusion is ludicrous. First, despite Guy's assertion, Cowdery also chose not to label his columns. The fact that both Smith and Cowdery didn't label their columns proves nothing about what they thought about the alphabets. Guy offered no evidence that Joseph Smith copied the work of Phelps and Cowdery. Rather, the evidence shows that the 3 men created their documents more or less independently and simultaneously. In his 2000 essay, Guy more accurately claimed just the opposite of what he claimed in 2017. The 3 manuscripts are not copies of each other. Free variants and synonyms abound, indicating that the manuscripts are independent notes made on the same occasion. Guy's more recent claim that Joseph Smith copied from Phelps and Cowdery is difficult to maintain, given the fact that Joseph Smith misspelled words which they wrote correctly. If Joseph Smith had copied the work of Phelps and Cowdery and cared less, why would he change the spelling of the invented Egyptian names? Obviously, Guy's assertion that Joseph Smith passively copied the work of Phelps and Cowdery isn't supported by the evidence. The situation was much more fluid and dynamic, resulting from the fact that Joseph Smith was giving explanations of the characters, as the heading of Phelps's alphabet indicates, and not simply dictating definitions, and each man was keeping notes. Guy's assertion that Joseph Smith dropped out text is an oversimplification of what actually occurs in the documents. It also begs the question by assuming what Guy is trying to prove, namely that Joseph Smith copied the other 2 alphabets. Instead of Joseph Smith leaving out text, it is more likely that Cowdery added to what Phelps and Smith had worked out, probably under Smith's instruction. While it is quite probable that Part 1 was being created somewhat simultaneously in the 3 alphabets, there is evidence for the direction in which the texts were evolving. In the previous video, it was observed that in Phelps's valuable discovery notebook, there was some hesitation about how to draw the Ketumen character, suggesting that the papyrus was damaged and difficult to read. In Joseph Smith's alphabet, the character for Ketumen resembles the earliest version, while Cowdery's reflects the revised version. Phelps, like Smith, appears to have copied the earliest version of the character into his alphabet, but later changed it by overriding to match Cowdery's. This would suggest that Cowdery's alphabet came last, and if anything, that Phelps and Smith were working together, though writing independently. When we compare Part 1 in the 3 alphabets, Joseph Smith's alphabet shows the most hesitation and editing, which isn't what one expects if Smith simply copied from Phelps and Cowdery. Not only are many of the names spelt differently from those in Phelps and Cowdery's alphabets, but 3 names are inserted above the line, 2 of them with unique spellings. In addition to his hesitation about the Ketumen character, Smith also canceled character 4 and drew another version of it in the margin. There are also 2 instances of names being corrected as they were being created by Smith. These observations point to Joseph Smith taking the lead in the project. In Part 2, Joseph Smith again shows his independence in the spelling of names. While all three men alternated between CH and K for the K sound in names, as in Alcabeth, Joseph Smith clearly favored CH, whereas both Phelps and Cowdery favored K. Out of 18 names with the K sound, Cowdery and Phelps deviated from their preference only twice, and Smith 4 times. Such a situation can't be explained by Guy's theory that Phelps and Cowdery worked together and then Joseph Smith passively copied from their work. Of the 46 definitions in the alphabets, there are 28 instances where Smith could have copied from either Phelps or Cowdery, as Guy has suggested, but there are also 18 instances where his text stands independent of theirs, which is not what one would expect of someone passively copying the work of others. Guy's conclusion that Joseph Smith cared less about the document than Cowdery or Phelps, and that it probably was not his idea because Smith didn't use column headings, section breaks, and dropped out text, is therefore based on a faulty and incomplete analysis of the sources. It is unnecessary to speculate about Phelps's and Smith's roles in producing the alphabets as Guy does, because Smith and/or Phelps has already told us through the best source we have on this matter, Joseph Smith's history, which states that during the latter part of July 1835, Smith was continually engaged in translating an alphabet to the Book of Abraham and arranging a grammar of the Egyptian language as practiced by the ancients. I hope you will join me for my next video where I will discuss the bound grammar and the unfolding of Egyptian astronomy. I will also respond to Guy's attempt to assign authorship to W. W. Phelps instead of Joseph Smith. I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for watching.